Welcome to Foreign Policy Focus, episode 49. I am the show's host, Kyle, and with me again today is Will Porter. Will is a journalist and commentator with a focus on U.S. foreign policy and Middle East affairs. He is a staff writer for the Daily Sheeple, and some of his freelance work can be found at the Libertarian Institute.org and antiwar.com. Of course, the last time I had Will on, we actually talked about our article that ran on antiwar.com, and we're going to follow up a little bit on that today, as well as talking about Iraq and Syria. So let's just get started. How you doing, Will?
Good, Kyle. Thank you for having me on. How are you?
I'm doing well myself. Pretty crazy stuff going on in the Middle East, keeping me pretty busy trying to read up on all of it. I'm sure you're feeling the same way. All right, so let's start off this time where we left off last time, and that's talking about the March 17th airstrike in Mosul. Why don't you just give us a quick recap on what happened and the new updates on that story?
Yeah, there was a investigation into the March 17th airstrike that concluded on May 25th, and it concluded that 101 civilians were actually killed inside the house in question. If you remember last time, it was mostly civilians in one building. However, they say 4 people died in a neighboring building, and 36 were still unaccounted for at the time when the investigation concluded. And that's far more realistic than the prior estimate of only 14 civilians killed in the strike. However, the Pentagon still says that ISIS put explosives in the house, so they're still trying to kind of shirk responsibility there. And as I mentioned last time, at least 7 eyewitnesses have disputed the claim that ISIS was anywhere near the building or put explosives inside. However, I guess we have to acknowledge that it's always possible they're covering for ISIS to save themselves. You know, they're still in Mosul, so they're still facing that danger. The Pentagon's investigation had said that they found bomb residue that was consistent with ISIS explosives. However, that might not be as compelling as it sounds because there's bomb residue all over Mosul, everywhere. You imagine that it's tracking through people's houses, on their clothing. There's been a lot of bombing going on there. However, the bomb that the American coalition had dropped on this 2-story house was a 500-pound bomb. And so it's not really, they didn't need additional explosives to collapse the building.
Where I got you at right now is you're saying that the Pentagon's saying that they dropped a 500-pound bomb on the house, but they're blaming at least a portion of the deaths on ISIS for placing their own explosives in the house. But it really doesn't matter anyways because the 500-pound bomb would have blown up the house itself. And the report isn't arguing, if I'm correct, that ISIS also detonated a bomb on the house, but that the U.S. bomb detonated the ISIS explosives.
Yes, exactly. They're not claiming that ISIS actually detonated the bombs themselves. They're saying their own bomb detonated the ISIS explosives. However, my point was just that a 500-pound bomb would have been more than enough to collapse this building. But the investigation also had said Iraqi forces that were stationed about 100 meters away from the house said that they saw snipers in the second story. But an Air Force Brigadier General named Matthew Isler, who oversaw the investigation, kind of said that surveillance of the house was sketchy. He said that there was blind spots and that the bad weather conditions prevented overhead surveillance. And so it sounded like he was trying to kind of say that they didn't really have a very good surveillance on the house. But other people who had hidden the building before, people who weren't there on the day of the March 17th strike, they specifically said that the house made a good hiding spot because it was off the main road, and that being only 2 stories tall, it didn't really make for a good sniper post. And so they thought that the coalition wouldn't bomb it. And so they explicitly said that it wasn't a good sniper outpost. So it's not quite consistent with the claims of the Iraqi forces who say they saw snipers there.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's amazing, and I just don't want to lose this point that people in Mosul right now are trying to pick houses based off of what isn't a good sniper spot so they won't get bombed by the U.S. government. I mean, that fact in itself seems pretty amazing to me.
Yeah, absolutely. There's very few places to hide there, so it makes sense why so many people too are in one building because there's slim pickings for hiding places.
Yeah. So, are we going to expect any else to come out of this story? Maybe somebody getting reprimanded at the very least, or a situation where there's any reforms put in place?
It's highly doubtful. Where the story stands now, the American coalition is basically saying that the Islamic State was responsible for this, or at least partially. They're trying to shirk some of the responsibility, so it's doubtful that any significant change would come from this.
All right. Well, thanks for updating us on that story, Will. I think it's really important just because of the number of people killed in the airstrike, and the Army's reaction to it just being so awful and so poor has really been disappointing. You wrote another story about civilian deaths in Mosul. This one tied hundreds of civilian dead in Mosul airstrike. Tell us about this article.
Yeah, so on Tuesday, May 30th, strikes on the Azenjili district of Mosul killed about 200 people and flattened like scores of houses, the report said. An Iraqi army officer said he wasn't sure if it was American or Iraqi warplanes, but it may have been both. It very well have been, because there were multiple strikes reported. And last time I was on your show, I had said that we just had to wait to see if the coalition would change its tactics over Mosul, because there was a pause on operations after the March 17th strike. And so it looks like the verdict is in now that civilians are still being killed in really large numbers from American airstrikes, or Iraqi airstrikes, coalition airstrikes in Mosul.
Yeah, and so even whether it was either the U.S.-backed coalition or the Iraqi government that carried out these airstrikes, they're all fighting on the same side, correct?
Yes, exactly.
And likely the U.S. would have some input on the airstrikes, whether they were Iraqi or obviously they're U.S. airstrikes.
I would think that they would coordinate their strikes, definitely, especially the Iraqi side.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. Oh, yeah, I mean, like, there's U.S. troops on the ground in Mosul and everything like that, so obviously the U.S. government, I'm guessing, has to know where these airstrikes are taking place.
Right, they may even be picking the targets, actually.
Yeah, and so this seems a little bit like a trend in Iraq, the increased airstrikes, and also this, the airstrike, was it a single airstrike or was it a group of airstrikes that killed all these civilians?
I believe it was several. I believe it was multiple, more than one. But I'm not clear on how many, though. All
right, great. Thanks. And so on Foreign Policy Focus 46, I discussed Mattis talking about the U.S. engaging in annihilation tactics in the fight against ISIS and how the U.S. was now dropping leaflets on the old city of Mosul telling civilians, leave or be bombed. And do you think the U.S. policy in Mosul is changing at all?
Well, they might be, stepping up the intensity of the operations in this last phase of the operation to take Mosul, but I'm not sure if we're going to see really any significant changes on the ground. Like we said, the coalition obviously hasn't really altered its tactics using air power because we're still seeing massive civilian casualties. So it's not so clear that they're going to change their tactics.
All right. On the last episode of Foreign Policy Focus, I talked about similarities between East Aleppo and the old city of Mosul. Do you agree that there's quite a few similarities between these two?
Oh, yeah, you're absolutely right to point out the similarities between the two. In both cities, there's a civilian population basically living under siege conditions, and religious radicals, militants, are not letting them leave, and they're caught fighting between a government and the radicals. However, one major difference that you'll notice between the two situations is Western media coverage. When Assad and Russia were trying to take East Aleppo, they were regularly condemned for their large amount of civilian casualties, and rightfully so. However, the American-led coalition has sort of gotten a pass. You'll notice that the reaction from the media is not at all the same, despite the fact that, as we've said, there's still huge casualties on the American side.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing just pointing out is that they're both enclaves of the East the East Aleppo area there wasn't connected to any other Syrian rebel territory, at least not at the end. One of the things Assad did, I guess, to prevent the absolute slaughter of tens of thousands of civilians in East Aleppo was to make a deal with the Syrian rebels to allow them to leave and then the Syrian government to take over. Any chance we'll see anything like that coming out of the old city of Mosul?
I highly doubt it. It seems like like you're saying, Mattis is talking about annihilation tactics, so that does not really bode well for any kind of reconciliation deal or, a ceasefire or anything.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I had kind of, I guess, been looking at is seeing how, like, the old city and East Aleppo were similar. If the U.S. could use anything that, Assad really did in East Aleppo to help win the fight in the old city. But it seems like what Assad did is make a deal with the bad guys. And the U.S. has a policy of not doing that, so it doesn't look like we're going to get that solution. Hopefully it doesn't involve just destroying the entire city to get rid of the ISIS fighters there. All right, do you have anything you expect to see in Mosul in the coming week?
Probably a lot more of the same. We're probably going to see a lot of really intense, like, close quarters combat in the old city. Some civilians will probably take the advice that are in the leaflets they're dropping, that it's saying they can leave. But the Iraqi forces there said that they would protect those who chose to stay. And so if people do choose to stay, I'm not so sure if they're going to be very safe, even though the Iraqis say they'll protect them, just based on what we've seen up till this point.
Yeah, absolutely. I read a story that's saying some Reuters journalists were in Mosul, and they've just been seeing dozens of dead bodies on the streets, looking like they're probably civilians trying to flee that were killed by ISIS. So, all right, now let's move on to Syria. You wrote a really cool article about Americans' foreign policy. Is a train wreck is the title. I think this one ran at the Daily Sheeple. I'll be sure to link to it in the show notes. And it's about the awful U.S. foreign policy in Syria. So do you want to just give us a little bit of insight into why you wrote this article and your general opinion of U.S. foreign policy in Syria, and then we'll get into some more detailed questions?
Sure, sure. Yeah, I wrote this thing just to point out there's a lot of contradictory policies happening now. So you'll have the Americans backing one side, and then you'll have them backing their enemies or the opposite force in another country or in the same country. So there's several different policies like this, and I kind of detail a few of them in the piece.
All right, yeah, and one of those is that you wrote that the YPG has received the first shipment of U.S. weapons. What did they get, and what are they going to be used for?
Well, the Pentagon is not saying exactly what they're delivering to the YPG. However, in the YPG, it's a group in Syria called the People's Protection Units, and I believe they're affiliated with a political party in Turkey called the PYD. However, we think that they're going to be getting some armored vehicles, a little bit of light weapons, and some ammunition. Now, the YPG had actually posted some pictures online of like a bunch of Abrams tanks and all this heavy weaponry, but they've since admitted that these photos are old and they're from different things, and that's not what they're getting right now. They said it was to boost morale. However, did you want to get into the Turkish aspect of this?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead? Well, I guess just start out by telling us why Turkey would even be upset about this in the first place, and then we could get into some more details about it as we go on.
Right. So the Turks are very angry about this, the American decision to arm the YPG, because they see that group as linked to the PKK, or the Kurdistan Workers' Party. And that's an organization in Turkey which the Turkish government has designated as a terrorist group. And the PKK has fought on and off with the Turkish government since the late 70s. And so the Turks believe the YPG are kind of linked with the PKK. And they're not entirely wrong to say that. There is some connection between the groups.
Okay. Do you know to the extent of the connection, or?
I think it's more informal. Like if you ask some fighters, they'll say, some days I'm a YPG, some days I'm a PKK, some days I'm a PJAK. And so I think there's sort of just like a lot of overlap between the groups. I don't know if there's a lot of official alliance between them.
All right. Yeah, absolutely. And so now what is the U.S. Doing to appease, because Turkey's a NATO ally, so what is the U.S. doing to appease Turkey while we're arming their enemies?
Well, the Trump administration has sort of vowed that they'll help Turkey, they'll support them in their fight with the PKK. Because as I said, Turkey's been fighting like actual wars with the PKK since the 70s, and they've been clashes have been flaring up lately. So the Americans have promised to help them in that fight. Now, Erdogan actually wants to convince the Trump administration to totally abandon the Kurds and instead back a force of 10,000 Turkish-backed fighters. But that's not very likely because the Americans have put a lot of investment into the Kurds up till this point.
Yeah, and I mean, Turkey has a very large army. I think right now it's probably in a little bit of disarray from the coup fallout where Erdogan has released a lot of his generals and imprisoned tons of people. And so there seems to be probably some holes in the Turkish army at this point. But to what extent do you think that Turkey is going to wage any war against the PKK or the YPG at all? Or I guess they're going to kind of have to sit on their hands because the U.S. is demanding it?
Well, they do bomb. They have bombed the YPG a couple times, a few YPG positions in recent weeks and months. But I just think they do whatever they can get away with. I'm not sure if they would launch like a full-scale assault if the Americans are backing them.
Yeah, I guess I figured they could get away with a lot because Erdogan had some of his thugs beat up some protesters in D.C. So,
about that.
So another place in your article where you really talked about some contradictions is the U.S. policy dealing with the popular mobilization forces and just how this differs in east of the Islamic State versus the west of the Islamic State.
Yeah, so the PMFs, as you said, that's the Popular Mobilization Forces, or they're called the Hashd al-Shabi. And this is an Iraqi umbrella organization comprised of about 40 militias. However, there are a lot of similar militias fighting in Syria, so they're pretty much part of the same group. Now, these are mostly Shia in Iraq, but there's some Sunni, Christian, and Yazidis fighting with the PMFs. And these groups were formed in 2014 after Ali al-Sistani, who's an Iraqi cleric, he issued a fatwa urging Iraqi Shia to go fight the Islamic State, basically. And so the Americans treat the Shia militias in Iraq differently from the ones in Syria, because the ones in Syria are directly fighting on behalf of Assad. Both of them are fighting ISIS in Iraq and Syria, but the Americans are worried about Iranian influence in Syria more, I suppose.
Okay, and so the U.S. is there any other reasons why the U.S. would have a different policy in Iraq than Syria, or is it just because of Iranian influence in Syria and Assad, and in Iraq that is a little bit more discreet?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of ironic, actually, because after the 2003 invasion of Iraq, this really handed that whole country over to Iranian influence. And Assad is known as an Iranian ally and stuff, too, so... But I'm not sure if Iranian influence is quite as strong in that country right now. And so I'm not actually sure if, what the major difference is. Iran has influence in both countries, but I guess in Syria it's more important that they prevent that.
Okay. One of the things that's been talked a lot about with the Shia militias and Assad is this Baghdad to Damascus highway. What is it, and why is it important?
Yeah, the highway you're referring to, that's an 850-kilometer stretch of road that links the two capital cities, Damascus and Baghdad. And it's an important highway to the Assad government because it's a surface supply route into Iraq, and the Iranians can send weapons out into Syria to their militias. And so that's what they're trying to take that right now. They're trying to secure that route. And the Americans are actually stepping up. They're equipping their own rebel proxy forces to try to prevent that.
Yeah. So other than the U.S. using the proxy forces, are they doing anything else to keep this route from being linked, or what's the U.S. doing to prevent from getting linked up?
Well, the last time I was on, we talked about the bombing of a convoy. It was a Shia militia convoy. There was 25 or so tanks there. And they were approaching an important border crossing that's along along this highway, the Damascus-Baghdad highway. And the American warplanes bombed a convoy to prevent it from linking up with Shia militias in Iraq. And so they're really trying to prevent this.
All right. And so what would be the implications for the Assad government if the Assad government was able to establish this highway?
Well, this would mean that Assad could, or the Iranians could move a lot of supplies to their militias and support for Assad. However, it also the route would also make it easier for Assad to move troops inside of his country, because he's planning some kind of assault on Raqqa, where I believe he wants to send troops in from the east and the west. And so having this highway would make it a lot easier to maneuver.
So you're saying that Assad is actually looking to attack Raqqa as well?
Yeah, I believe he's planning to assault that city.
Oh, all right. Good to know. I had heard that he was focusing more on Deir ez-Zor nets, but that could have been just bad information on my behalf.
No, I think it's both, actually. I think they're looking to take both. I think Deir ez-Zor is more immediate, but Raqqa, ultimately, yes, they'll want to take that city.
Okay. And so what's going to happen here? It sounds like at some point there may be some direct conflict between the U.S. and Assad to keep this highway from being completed.
Yeah, I mean, there's really no way that the Americans can block the highway without some kind of confrontation with Assad. I mean, we have to remember that the Americans are illegally occupying Syria right now, and Assad is the sovereign government. You know, he presides over the sovereign government of Syria. So the Americans trying to dictate which roads in his own country he can and can't use, that is, sure to lead to some kind of conflict.
Yeah, and so eventually, right, though, the U.S. would have to get directly involved to keep this from happening, is what it sounds like. I mean, even if it means the U.S. putting their own soldiers in harm's way and then bombing Assad, and they claim that our soldiers were threatened.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really, there's no way to avoid conflict with this.
All right. So other than that, what are some of the implications and fallout from all this U.S. policy in Syria?
Well, something that I'm particularly worried about is that the American concern with this highway is sort of, it goes beyond the immediate war. So they're worried about long-term Iranian influence and the ability of Iran to move supplies to Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, which they worry will threaten Israel. And so if that's the worry of the Americans, this isn't going to go away after the war is over. And so that leads me to believe that there's some kind of long-term plans in mind to stay. And this is speculation, but it's not implausible considering the last 15 years of American foreign policy, which is
definitely
regime change.
I've heard a couple people come out and say what was the phrase they used? A highway from Tehran to the Mediterranean Sea.
Right.
describing this. And so it seems like an awful lot of fear-mongering there. I'm guessing the Israel lobby probably has their forces full out on this one, trying to influence American policy in any way possible to prevent it. I just don't want to be lost on all of our viewers that if you're somebody who's like, oh no, this is going to empower Assad, this would not have been an issue if it wasn't for the 2003 Iraq War that turned a Saddam Hussein dictatorship into a Iranian ally government. All right, well, anything else do we have going on? Any other foreign policy news you'd like to chat about before we end this call?
I think we covered all the stories that we intended to.
All right, sounds good. Well, if you got anything you want to plug, anything you want to talk about, go for it.
Sure. I'm a staff writer at a website called the Daily Sheeple, thedailysheeple.com. I do news coverage and commentary 5 days a week. My Twitter handle is WKPANCAP. My personal blog is TL Vanguard, that is the Libertarian Vanguard.wordpress.com. And you can find my other writing at the Libertarian Institute and antiwar.com.
All right, thanks, Will. You can also find my daily news roundup at libertarianinstitute.org. The website for this podcast is foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. And I'm sure myself and Will would really appreciate it if you shared the show and got it out there to more listeners. Let's inform people on foreign policy. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Kyle.